You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Máté Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Welcome to today's episode of the GeoPod podcast. My name is Máté Vigóczki, a researcher on Russia at the Center for Geopolitics. Our guest today is Arseny Sivitsky, a foreign policy and security policy analyst and a fellow at MCC. The topic of our conversation is the Russian-Ukrainian war, which will soon enter its third year. The events of the past 20-plus months can be divided into several stages based on the dynamics of the war. Now, when probably a new stage is beginning, it is time to look in the future and review possible scenarios. Mr. Sivitsky, at the end of 2023, what can you say about the spectrum of the most likely scenarios?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here and for the opportunity to share with you my thoughts on the most large-scale conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. So, definitely we have to think about the future, especially because on the one hand, we can observe a stalemate on the battlefields, but on the other hand, probably something worse can still happen and come. When it comes to the spectrum of scenarios, it definitely varies from the strategic defeat of each of the opposing sides to a sort of geopolitical stalemate according to so-called career model, or to the new phase of large-scale escalation. I think it is clear that when the war started, everyone thought that Ukraine would collapse in 5-7 days. So even the Western intelligence agencies believed that Russia could inflict a strategic defeat to Ukraine, understanding that it would lead to the collapse of the Ukraine's statehood and its territorial integrity. But it happened, and since April last year, the Ukrainian side actually took the strategic initiative in its hand, started liberating its territories, and many analysts started to speculate about a potential strategic defeat inflicted to the Russian Federation, especially if the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces could be successful. It hasn't happened. But nevertheless, different experts and analysts, especially in the West, were speculating about this probability, understanding that it could lead even to the collapse of the Russian Federation itself. Not mentioning the fact that the future of the political regime in Moscow will be called into question, as well as the sphere of Russian influence on the post-Soviet space, as well as in the other parts of the world. But at this moment, we can see the situation of the stalemate or a deadlock on the battlefields. Therefore, there are currently a lot of discussions about the fact that maybe it's time to sit down to the negotiation table and to settle the conflict by the peaceful means. We have been following a lot of publications in the Western media. We understand that both Ukrainian society and the Western allies have been tired because of this conflict. They have been at least psychologically exhausted. And due to the lack of progress in the counteroffensive, some Western states are pushing Ukraine to sit down to the negotiation table now, according to some Ukrainian officials. The Korean model has been very popular till recently in such discussions as a model how we can at least freeze the conflict. And it envisaged division of Ukraine into two parts, like it happened with Korea after the Korean Wars. So one part stays under the Russia's influence. So we are speaking about these 4 occupied territories by the Russian armed forces: Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye regions. But on the other hand, the rest part of Ukraine is capable to join the Euro-Atlantic institutions, or at least find an in-depth form of cooperation like the South Korea did after the end of the Korean War. But judging by the developments in Russia on the one hand, and also in Kiev, I think this scenario at this moment is highly unlikely. Why? Because still the opposing parties are perceiving this conflict as existential one. The Ukrainian society is fighting for its state, for its territorial integrity, for its survival. And it can't afford losing this war. On the other hand, Russia also can't afford losing this war because, first of all, its negative implications, which could lead to the collapse of the political regime in Moscow, not mentioning the fact that it will definitely undermine the Russian sphere of influence on the post-Soviet space, as well as in the other parts of the world. In addition to the collapse of Russia itself, the scenario that has been discussed, especially by the Western strategists and analysts. So there is no space for compromises and concessions, and it means that at some point it will lead to a new phase of escalation. So that is why, from my point of view, it's the most likely scenario in 2024. So Ukraine hasn't managed to achieve successes in its counteroffensive operation by this moment, and therefore probably the next what we should expect that Russia will launch a new large-scale offensive immediately after the presidential elections in March next year. So we have seen a lot of preparation work for this, starting from the reconfiguration of the entire mobilization system, reconfiguration of the economy for the war mode regime, as well as the fact that recently the Russian leadership has increased number of the Russian armed forces. So it added 170,000 personnel more to the overall number of the Russian army. So definitely preparations are going on, and I think it's highly likely connected to the fact that Russia is planning a new offensive next year. So if this scenario happens, we can't exclude even a scenario of evolving of this conflict into a regional war with a direct engagement or direct conflict between Russia and NATO, since this scenario envisages transferring of the hostilities to the western part of Ukraine, close to the EU and NATO member states' borders. Not mentioning the fact that if the West is still continuing supplying weapons and also hosts some military systems on its territories, it may be considered by the Russian side as a direct engagement of NATO into the conflict. Just to give you an example, recently Russian experts have been speculating on this scenario by analyzing consequences of F-16 fighter jets deliveries to Ukraine. And as we know, Ukraine doesn't have an appropriate infrastructure to host these F-16s, not mentioning the fact that if they are located in Ukraine, then they become an easy target for Russian missiles or Iranian kamikaze drones. So as a solution, probably they will be stationed in Romania, Poland, and some other Central European states. And for Ukrainians to use this F-16 against Russian troops, they will need first to actually take these aircrafts in the airspace of NATO member states to cross the airspace with Ukraine, and only then start operating these fighter jets against the Russian troops. But Russian side has been warning the NATO, the other Western allies, that it could lead to the direct clash with NATO. Why? Because in this case, the Kremlin will consider such operations as a direct engagement of NATO into the conflict, since some of the member states are providing their airspace for Ukrainian armed forces to conduct military operations. And it gives like a legal justification for Russia not just to use the conventional weapons in order to prevent this threat, but even nuclear weapons. And if you look what Russia has been doing since the beginning of the war, it's actually gradually moving on the ladder of nuclear escalation. I would remind you that on the third day of the so-called special military operation, the Russian leadership actually announced a special duty regime for the strategic deterrence forces. So then Moscow suspended the New START treaty. Just 1 month ago, the Russian side revoked its ratification of the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. Finally, the Russian side had already deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. So We have been seeing such a nuclear signaling from the Russian side that should be taken seriously, and it's not just a rhetorical threats. We can observe a clear preparations for the nuclear escalation scenario from the Russian side if something goes not according to the grand plan. So unfortunately, from this perspective, the next year will be very tough, both for Ukraine, but also for Europe. This escalation scenario should be beared in mind, but I don't see any way how we can prevent this escalation, since neither Russia nor Ukraine would like to sit down to the negotiation table, and even the West stops supplying weapons to Ukraine. It will not lead to Ukraine's concessions towards Russia.
Yes, this is what I wanted to ask from you, because you mentioned high probability scenarios and low one, but there are huge what-ifs in the West as well. So you mentioned the support of Ukraine, and as we can see that one of Ukraine's biggest supporter, the USA, is believed by many to be unable to maintain the current rate of support for a long time, partly because of the political debates, and there is some chance that Donald Trump will return, but partly also because of the Israel-Hamas war. Could you please tell us something about these two factors?
Yeah, definitely the escalation of the conflict between Israel and Hamas has distracted, at least in the media, attention of the Western world from Ukraine for a while. But I have doubts that this distraction could seriously undermine Western support to Ukraine when it comes to the military and humanitarian aid. First of all, because these two conflicts, I mean the Russia-Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas conflicts, they are very different in their nature. And Israel, to conduct its operation against Hamas, requires a very different military systems and weapons. Comparing to Ukraine, which needs now fighter jets, helicopters, more artillery shells, long-range missiles, etc., etc. Israeli army has everything to do this, to conduct this operation. As you can see, the Western allies have provided them a very different type of support. So the United States and other Western allies have deployed at least 3 carrier strike groups in the region to contain potential engagement of Iran and its allies in the Middle East in this confrontation. So until the conflict hasn't escalated to the regional level, I don't see perspectives that the West would change its priorities in terms of providing support either to Ukraine or to Israel. And we can see also from the internal debates in the United States that from this $106 billion package, $60 billion are allocated for Ukraine and only 16 to Israel. So I think that it is a subject of the political debate now in the United States because of the upcoming presidential campaign. But the issue will be fixed as soon as the political campaign, the presidential elections are over in the United States. And there are not very high chances that even in the event of Donald Trump's victory, Ukraine will lose the support of the United States. So it is quite interesting fact that the toughest sanctions that the United States introduced against Russia were actually under the Donald Trump's presidency, comparing to what Obama did. So we can imagine that, yes, in Russia there are some hopes for Trump's re-election, but we need to understand that the political system in the United States is very complex, and there is a system of checks and balances, and it's not enough for Donald Trump only to have a will to end this conflict in 24 hours. So he has to take into consideration this very complex system, and that is why I even don't exclude that if Trump is re-elected, he will be pushed to increase the number of and the scale of the military aid to Ukraine. So what we can definitely say that until the United States are distracted either by the internal battles or by the escalation in the Middle East, still we should bear in mind that in the Rammstein coalition, it is about 15 states that are providing support to Ukraine currently, and Europe actually have been providing even more support to Ukraine comparing to the United States. So I think this state of affairs can't lead to the decrease of hostilities in the battlefields, as well as to undermine the Ukraine's will to fight for their state, for their territorial integrity and their survival. So this is the most important factor. So the will of Ukrainian people to defend its own country.
Arseny Sivitsky, thank you for answering the questions and helping us to see this situation more clearly. I really hope that we can talk here again next time soon. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.